The focus of this presentation will be on stress, coping, and burnout prevention. This presentation will offer a set of universal prevention strategies geared toward adolescents and young adults in specifically managing academic burnout. Later in this presentation, there will be a review of some of the unique stressors experienced by older adults. Sometimes in life it feels like we're burning our candle at both ends. I think many of us can agree with that statement. First of all, what do we know? We know that adolescence is a time of increased stress, and it's characterized by a marked increase in depressive symptoms. However, we know this is moderated by how young people respond to those stressors. We also know that, according to the medical model, stress is a state of arousal within an organism in response to an environmental precipitant. This physiological condition can be measured by increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and the presence of stress hormones that heighten the sympathetic nervous system arousal of that organism. So, while normal stress is adaptive and prepares us to deal with danger, as in the fight or flight response, long-term chronic stimulation of the stress response system has been linked to depressed immunity and diminished well-being. So, let's talk about stress itself. We can differentiate stress as to whether it is independent or dependent upon the individual. For instance, independent stress is concerned with what is presently happening to cause that stress, while dependent stress focuses more on the personal factors like one's mood and behavior. Research tells us that it is the dependent stressor, or how the individual responds, that is more predictive of depressive symptoms than what those stressors actually are. Ultimately, we want to understand what the most prevalent stressors are for young people so we can focus on where and when to implement the how strategies. Normative stressors for young people can include school, physical and developmental changes, going to a new school, having to make new friends, and having to deal with increased academic demands, while non-normative stressors can be acute like divorce or death, or chronic stressors like parent conflict, poverty, or learning difficulties. Coping is defined as the ability to change one's thoughts and behaviors to manage specific internal or external demands that create stress. Another word for this is adaptation. Piaget's theory of cognitive development breaks this down into two non-mutually exclusive processes known as assimilation, basically rising to the occasion, buckling down, and maybe asking for help if needed, and accommodation, such as revising one's goals, setting more reasonable expectations, and working with what one has in order to deal with external demands as best as one can. We also have adaptive, or solution-focused coping, and maladaptive, or problem-focused coping. Adaptive is all about figuring out what works to resolve a problem. Maladaptive coping is essentially focusing on the negative aspects of any situation, whether it's the situation itself, the independent stressor, or one's feelings of helplessness and hopelessness and being able to respond to that situation, the dependent stressor. So maladaptive coping is when we start to see some pretty negative behaviors and ways to cope. So now we can put all of this together and begin to focus our prevention strategy on ways to apply assimilative, accommodative, and hopefully adaptive coping strategies toward the dependent and normative stressors experienced by our target population. In other words, we're going to focus on the ways in which young people respond to the normal daily stressors that are particular to where they are in their development. So, through this lens, our intervention will focus on academic burnout prevention for adolescents and young adults. A little background on why I'm doing this topic. Student distress has been increasingly recognized as a public health issue, with studies showing 30% of university students showing depression, 15% having suicidality or suicidal thoughts over the past 12 months. This leads to a high level of attrition, with only 48% of students passing their first year. That's a problem. So, While some students are able to develop active, adaptive, solution-focused coping strategies, others feel hopeless and helpless to change their situation, which leads to avoidance, negative attitudes toward their studies, a loss of interest, and a lack of confidence in their ability to succeed, which is known as the burnout syndrome, a condition involving avoidance, negativity, loss of interest, and lack of confidence. So, the prevention strategy will focus on using social media to reach out to the younger audience. And now we can look at some examples of the messages we will use to affect behavior change within young people. We're beginning to realize that in this day and age, burnout affects the very youngest members of our education system, and we need to create awareness about this growing problem. The child in this picture represents the burden placed on young people to succeed very early in their academic career. When a kid internalizes this need to be on all the time, it leads to those symptoms we talked about: the frustration, the need to do well at all costs, the hopelessness she experiences when she doesn't meet the expectations she places on herself, that her parents place on her, that her teachers place on her. So the link at the bottom of the slide here directs those parents, educators, and kids themselves to an online resource that educates the reader on what leads to burnout and how to prevent it and why it happens. Obviously, this slide is focused more toward the caregivers, given that they're often in the best position to help their kids once they have a better understanding of what's happening. But this particular slide can be posted on a school counseling department website, on a Facebook group for parents of elementary students, or any number of social media or social networking platforms. This slide contains a TED Talk video developed for kids by kids. It's a 3-minute video filled with quotes, anecdotes, and testimonies from elementary and middle school kids sharing what it means to be stressed out. Kids need to be validated that they're not alone in their experiences, and they are more likely to listen to and help their peers when it comes to finding better ways to cope. Most kids these days have devices with all the bells and whistles, so I've included a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide that students can scan and have this video pop up right on their phones or tablets or whatever they use to connect to the internet. Moving on to the university level, this slide can be posted on a Student Services Center website or blog, and it provides 6 helpful tips that could be particularly important for this young fellow right here on the right who appears to be overwhelmed by his studies. Again, we have links here that will inform the student about the signs and symptoms of burnout and how to get help. This might be considered a universal strategy, but it could also be targeted given that university students are at particular risk given the statistics mentioned earlier. All right. Finally, a slide like this could be posted on a Facebook group or a University Student Services Center blog where the students would be invited to comment and share their experiences and helpful strategies with their peers. There is some evidence that commiseration can actually help young people to not feel so isolated in their experiences. Moving from the adolescent and young adult population, we move on to older adults. So, with the kids, the adolescents, and the young adults, the focus has been specifically on burnout prevention. However, older adults face a different set of stressors, so we need to take a step back and take a broader view of stress and examine how it's experienced by older adults. Moving away from burnout, we're kind of looking at stress management in general. Interesting here, we see that retirement is a stressor. Well, retirement's a double-edged sword. It can be seen as an opportunity to engage in meaningful activities for which time wouldn't have previously allowed. This includes traveling, taking up a hobby, spending more time with friends and family, all that fun stuff you can look forward to when you're ready to be done with your career. But it can also be seen as a stressful transition that can impact one's sense of purpose while also forcing the older adult to make ends meet on a fixed income. We also see health and social issues coming into play. symptoms of stress. And on to the prevention strategies. One study suggests psychotherapy as a prevention strategy. How about that? Usually we think of psychotherapy as the treatment of a diagnosable condition, but using cognitive behavioral and problem-solving interventions as indicated prevention strategies for older adults with subthreshold symptoms demonstrated positive effect on symptom reduction versus controls. However, the 2018 study by Lee et al. Indicated that prevention can also harm older patients if conditions that are unlikely to cause symptoms in the patient's lifetime are identified and treated as if they were a problem. So, we have to be careful to not intervene with preventive efforts if the lag time to benefit for an intervention exceeds an individual's life expectancy. Other strategies include sleep hygiene interventions, reminiscence opportunities known as life review, and regular exercise. Mindfulness-based stress reduction also showed improved coping in areas of psychological flexibility and acceptance of physical health limitations. So, in conclusion, I have a prevention-oriented slide targeted to older adults, which could be uploaded to Twitter or Facebook or really any social media platform. It has a link to John Kabat-Zinn's website that has free talks and exercises, and one of my favorite quotes from his book, Full Catastrophe Living. Oh, I've had my moments. If I had to do it over again, I'd have more of them. In fact, I'd try to have nothing else, just moments, one after another, instead of living so many years ahead of each day. So, that's it. And here are the references that were cited throughout the presentation.